Africa 54's Ndemiake Mokalele has just returned from Capitol Hill, and she joins us now with some exciting news on plans to improve Africa's development. Hello, Ndemi.
Well, hi to you, Vincent. Africa's energy crisis is often cited as a hindrance to its growth and development. United States President Barack Obama launched Power Africa in July during his visit to the continent. It is an initiative created to help double access to electricity for sub-Saharan Africans. Today, on Capitol Hill, a huge crowd gathered to hear stakeholders in the power industry discuss how increased power could improve Africa's development and growth. An estimated 600 million people in Africa are without electricity. This lack of power impacts their daily lives as well as larger investment opportunities. Congressman Edward Royce and Congresswoman Karen Bass of the U.S. House of Representatives co-sponsored the event. They reiterated America's commitment to addressing the power crisis in Africa, and they spoke about what will happen if that crisis is ignored.
We are working long-term on reauthorizing the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act to increase trade with the continent of Africa. With 7 of the world's fastest-growing economies taking place on the continent, and the United States really, in my opinion, being a little slow to recognize Africa's growth, it's time that we step up, and I think this is part of the process. And so if we want to increase trade with Africa, then us, the United States, participating in building out Africa's infrastructure, I think it's a win-win on both sides.
What's unique about Electrify Africa, the legislation that Karen and I are working on here, and it takes, I think, a broader view. We appreciate the administration's effort as well. This will go in tandem with Power Africa. But the approach that we're looking at here, it is one that is going to affect all of sub-Saharan Africa, and affect it in a balanced way in which we address the energy needs of the continent, from hydro to gas to cleaner burning solutions. You know, if it's coal, it's going to be clean coal. We're going to push this in the direction of reusable energy.
Well, in attendance at the Africa Policy Breakfast was Stephen Hayes, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, and he joins us now. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Hayes. Well, let's first of all talk about the Electrify Africa, which is the legislation being proposed by, in part, Mr. Royce and Ms. Bass, that it will declare United States in consultation with sub-Saharan African countries to encourage at least 20,000 megawatts of additional generation capacity by 2020. Very exciting news, in addition to what President Obama said in July. From your opinion, why only now? Because obviously this has been a problem for a long time.
I think the reality is that China has awakened a lot of interest. I think that whether we ever admit that or not, I think that new investors seeing that the potential of the African market, which I think the U.S. was slow on politically, I think that there was a certain taking for granted of Africa, very frankly. And I think they realize that countries will necessarily gravitate towards those countries who are investing in them. And Africa has been considered a longtime friend to the U.S. as a whole, and most of the countries. And I think there's a realization that we haven't done enough, and we need to do a lot more.
And you've made that point several times, and there's CCA, that's one of the biggest groups of private investors to the continent. You've noted how the U.S. and investors have been really slow to invest in Africa. Has power access been one of the issues, in addition to politics and other governance issues?
In addition to politics, in addition to, I think, an unfavorable image in media, which I think is largely out of date. Certainly power is a major issue. You can't invest unless you have a reliable power source. If your power source, even if you're staying in Nigeria at the Abuja Hilton, if the power source goes off 6 times a day, it sends a very bad signal. So power is absolutely essential. There's not a country in Africa right now that's meeting its current power needs, let alone the power needs of the future. And that includes South Africa. South Africa is meeting roughly 90% of its current needs, but its future needs are going to be far greater. Nigeria is meeting about 20% of its current needs. So that's important.
So what these initiatives, Power Africa, Electrify Africa, how will they help to really try to double up, triple up the megawatt access?
They're going to help. The goals, frankly, in my own opinion, are a little modest, but perhaps realistic. Power is the area where the U.S. can make a difference, where it can compete with anybody in the world. And the fact that the President of the United States has let loose, in fact, more than let loose, but really encouraged strongly XM to be more open on Africa, at least on power, is going to help investors. So I think it's very important.
And in terms of how directly the lack of power has been inhibiting development and growth, what do you see as the key hindrance to that happening on the continent, which you visit so often?
Well, I think there's got to be a united power grid for a starter. You can't have a power grid in one country that stops at the borders and expect still investment region-wide, and the regional markets are very important. So I think that the initial guaranteeing investment through the XM Bank is important because it's going to make other banks more open. The banking sector in the U.S. has been really reluctant to support investment in Africa. So the leader on that has to be XM, and this helps at least open that in a lot of ways.
On a non-power related story, you just recently held your 9th CCC USA Africa Business Summit in Chicago for the first time. You said it was the biggest ever.
It wasn't the biggest ever. I think it was one of the best. And the fact that we had so few U.S. government people involved because of the shutdown actually I think helped it, because there was far more business-to-business interaction, less listening to government speakers. I mean, I certainly would have liked to have had them there, but it was a very successful summit. And in fact, on Power Africa, we had a strong Power Africa working group, which had 35, 40 U.S. companies come in. Okay. So I think it's very promising.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. This Stephen Hayes, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, one of the largest groupings of U.S. private investors to Africa, and joined us here on Africa 54. Back to you, Vincent.
Well, thanks a lot, Ndimi. We want to know what you think about Africa 54. Join the conversation on Facebook and check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com.